We'll be looking at replacing a rear suspension arm on this Ford today. This is a Mondeo Mk3 hatch, so it's specific to that model. But the video will be generally applicable to replacing this type of component on most cars. This car failed its road inspection because of this bush. The rubber is a bit gone, and the tester complained that he could move the bar arm more than he was happy with. So the arm is attached to the wheel knuckle there, and it goes forward up to the chassis up in there somewhere. And I am just going to replace the entire arm. You could get new bushings and press them out and in, but for the cost and the hassle, frankly, it's easier to just get a new assembly. You would need to do everything in this video in addition to pressing new bushings anyway. So here's the new arm that I got. The Ford calls it a bar. Make sure you get the right part number, of course. Now, talking about parts, here's a diagram. What I need to replace is this number 5, rear suspension tie bar. I want to draw your attention to alignment issues briefly. I'll be working with these fittings here today. They're just regular nuts and bolts. These trailing arms might be different, however. This one at the front is nothing unusual, but if you look at this one, you will see these components. This is called a cam, and this bolt is eccentric, as you can see. So these are alignment adjustments. So my point is that if you're touching something like this, you would need to go to a wheel and tire place after the job and get the alignment redone. But if you're not, you'll be fine with that. Okay, on with the job. On this car, to get at the front end of the arm, a few things need to come away. Firstly, this plastic shield. There's a T30 Torx screw up in there, which needs to come out. Then there's this crappy folded sheet metal nut, which are actually quite large in size. I really hate them. I don't have a large enough socket. They'll usually come off with a crescent spanner, but this time it was too recessed. I couldn't get at it with one, so I resorted to some long nose vice grips, and that worked. Now, I didn't remove this shield entirely. It was enough to just leave it flapping around loose. Then the handbrake cable is clipped to the arm, and it needs to come away. First this cable tie, and then the metal clip just pulls off with a bit of pain. Cable needs to be pushed out of its clip here. Then the ABS sensor wire also runs along the arm. It has 3 clips retaining it, like so. These just come out with a bit of force. I didn't break any, but they might, I suppose, if they're old and brittle. If they do, I wouldn't worry about it, because you could just put it back in the same place using cable ties through the same holes. I think that would be fine. Then the exhaust hanger might need to be disconnected. This depends on the engine you have. I think mine's the 4-cylinder. I also have a particular video on lowering an exhaust, which goes over dealing with these rubber hangers. So if they're giving you trouble, then go check that out. The secret is basically silicone grease, as you can see. Right, now we can actually start undoing some bolts. On this car, I can't actually access the front end of the bar, so the bracket that it mounts to has to come off first. That's what these bolts are. There's 2 of them. They're a 15mm head, and you'll need a bit of an extension bar and then quite a decent length breaker bar to turn them. Now, these 2 have the highest tightening torques in this job, and they're also put in with thread locker, so they do take quite a bit of effort to turn. So make sure that you're using quality sockets and get everything lined up nice and square. You don't want to round off a bolt head. Okay, once those bolts are out, then that end of the bar will fall away. Get it clear of the cables and stuff, and let it lie on the ground. And then it's time for the other end. Now this one's a lot easier to access, as you can see. It's the bolt that goes through the bushing itself this time, and it is an 18mm hex. Same story applies though, still quite a bit of force required on it. Anyway, then the bar will be free of the car, And then the last thing to do will be to get it out of the bracket. This is the bolt that goes through the bushing. It's much harder to work on when it's loose, particularly when it's done up so tight. The trick is to get a spanner on the bolt head in such a way that you can weight it down against the ground, so to say, and the spanner will prevent the bolt turning while you use the breaker bar with the socket on the nut. So then that's the final bolt, and then the bracket will be loose and the arm's finally finished with. So you might be pressing new bushings in, but in my case it's just a case of checking the new arm is the correct part, and then we can start reversing the process. Firstly though, you'll want to clean up all of the bolts because they do have old thread locker on them, not to mention dirt and grease and all that. I'm using brake clean and a toothbrush here, which is not ideal really. I should have a wire brush. Mine's gone missing is all. Anyway, get them clean and let them dry, and then you should add some new thread locker. This is Loctite 243, and I'm just putting it in the nut here because I didn't remember where the nut would end up on the bolt thread. Anyway, put it back together and get the nut done up semi-tight with a ratchet. And next we need to talk about torque and torque wrenches. I suggest that you use one on a job like this because guesswork around wheels and brakes and suspension components is not smart. The tightening torque for this particular nut is 103 Newton meters. I don't know why it's so specific. Probably that's just a conversion from a round number in foot-pounds. Let's call it 100 Newton meters. And you could get on with it. However, there is another complication, and that is this bracket doesn't locate itself against the arm at a particular angle without putting it on the car. So if we tighten it at the wrong angle, the bushing will be under unnecessary stress when it's installed to the knuckle. So you could leave it loose like this and torque it up on the car. But as you've already seen here, that's about impossible in this case because the bushing, nut and bolt are inaccessible when the bracket's mounted in place. So what I did actually was put it on the car and semi-tighten it part way, just using spanners, which I could access with spanners, and then take it off again to use the torque wrench. The other thing that you could do is try to locate it manually while it's on the car by using a spacer of some kind between the arm and the bracket. This screwdriver handle, for example, happens to fit in there perfectly. So you see here I can jam it in there and then do the spanner and weight acrobatics while using the torque wrench to get the final tightness correct. The reason that this matters is that proper procedure is bushings should be tightened up against only when the weight of the car is on the suspension. Otherwise they get locked into an unnatural resting position, which means that they'd end up wearing faster because they're permanently more stressed than they should be. On a proper lift, this is easy for a mechanic to deal with, but if you're on the ground like in this video, what you can do is use a floor jack to lift up the rear wheel and carefully take the weight of the car on it. But you must absolutely have the handbrake on hard, and you must trust the handbrake lest the wheel try to roll off the jack. And keep the axle stand in place and make sure that it's still taking a little bit of weight. And that should be more or less safe. Then you can put the relevant fittings back in place, knowing that everything is in its rest position. Get these bracket bolts back in first. Remember to clean and thread locker them like before. But don't tighten them, otherwise you'll have trouble doing the other end. Speaking of which, get that bolt through the bushing and into the knuckle thread. You may have to play with it a little to get the angle correct, but it should go in easy enough with the wheel lifted like it is. And this is the next bolt that can be torqued. It's the same 103 Newton meters as the front end I showed you off the car. Now the front bracket bolts can be torqued next, and these are spec'd at 120 Newton meters each, which is quite a bit. So as with removing them, take your time, use a good socket, make sure things are lined up, and use a torque wrench. Now both the bushing fittings are tight and all the relevant torques have been set. So at this point you can let the wheel down again so that everything's a bit safer to work under. And all the bits and pieces can be put back together. The exhaust hanger back on its hook. Handbrake cable back in its clip or clips. Push or tie the ABS sensor cable back in place. Oh, by the way, if you have HID headlights, you'll have another sensor cable here for the self-leveling. I don't have that. Then that metal handbrake cable clip. I used multi-grips to get the damn thing back on. Use some grease on its contact points if you have to. That'll make it a bit easier. Redo the cable tie. This isn't a factory thing, obviously. It's just that the handbrake cable is usually loose in this clip, so the tie stops it from knocking. Lastly, the plastic shield, the nut at the front, and the Torx screw in the middle. Then you can lower the car, and it's done. Go for a drive and check that you don't hear anything strange coming from the rear. But that's about it. Hope it was helpful.